In the spring of 1969, deep in the mist-covered mountains of South Vietnam, one valley carried a reputation that made even hardened soldiers uneasy. The A Shau Valley, a narrow jungle corridor near the border with Laos, was more than just terrain. It was a lifeline for the North Vietnamese army, a hidden artery of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and a fortress where the enemy dared the Americans to come after them. It was here that the United States launched Operation Apache Snow, one of the largest campaigns of the Vietnam War. Its goal, sweep the valley, destroy enemy supply bases, and break the grip of the North Vietnamese forces. What followed was a brutal test of endurance, where American paratroopers, South Vietnamese troops, and North Vietnamese regulars clashed in battles that pushed men to their limits. At the heart of the operation was one hill, an unremarkable rise on the map known as Hill 937. But after 10 days of relentless assaults, blood-soaked jungle fighting, and staggering casualties, it would earn another name, Hamburger Hill. A name that captured the grinding horror of combat, where young soldiers were chewed up like meat in a grinder. Before we dive in, I want to hear from you. What other forgotten battles of the Vietnam War should I cover next? Let me know in the comments. And if you're passionate about military history, don't forget to hit subscribe. Most of you watching aren't subscribed yet, and together we're building a channel dedicated to telling these untold stories. To understand why Operation Apache Snow happened, we first need to look at the battlefield that shaped it, the A Shau Valley. This was no ordinary patch of jungle. It stretched about 30 miles long and 1 mile wide, tucked against the border with Laos. The terrain was rugged, steep, and covered in a thick canopy of trees. Fog and rain often made the valley feel like a world cut off from everything else. For the North Vietnamese army, the valley was priceless. It served as a natural corridor for the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the vast supply route that carried men, weapons, and ammunition from the north into South Vietnam. Hidden under the jungle cover, the NVA built base camps, bunkers, and storage sites that allowed them to move forces in secret and launch operations deeper into the south. The Americans had known about the valley's importance for years. Back in 1966, the A Shau Special Forces Camp had fallen after a fierce battle, proving how committed the NVA was to holding the area. Despite later operations, the North Vietnamese always returned. By 1969, the valley had become a symbol of their strength and a thorn in America's side. For U.S. commanders, clearing the valley was about more than denying the enemy a stronghold. It was also about showing that American forces could still strike hard, even as political pressure at home was growing. By early 1969, President Richard Nixon was in the White House. He had begun speaking of Vietnamization, the plan to gradually turn the war over to South Vietnamese forces, but the U.S. military was still expected to carry the fight. That spring, Lieutenant General Melvin Zeiss of the 24th Corps gave the order. The 101st Airborne Division, supported by South Vietnamese units, would launch a major sweep into the valley. The goal was to destroy enemy positions, disrupt supply lines, and if possible, force the NVA into a decisive confrontation. The stage was set. The Americans were about to enter one of the most dangerous valleys in Vietnam. What they didn't know was that the operation would soon lead them into one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. By May of 1969, the plan to strike the A Shau Valley was ready. The operation would be called Apache Snow, part of a larger series of missions aimed at breaking the North Vietnamese stronghold in this region. Unlike small raids or quick sweeps, this one would be massive, designed to send a clear message to the enemy and to Washington alike. The main force would be the 101st Airborne Division, famous for its paratroopers and its Eagle insignia. They were supported by units from the South Vietnamese 1st Division, along with artillery, engineers, and a powerful arsenal of American air power. In total, more than 10,000 troops were committed to the operation. The strategy was simple on paper, but dangerous in practice. U.S. and ARVN units would advance from multiple directions, pushing into the valley and converging on suspected enemy strongholds. Their targets included a chain of hills and ridges where the North Vietnamese army was believed to have bunkers, supply caches, and command posts. But the planners knew it wouldn't be easy. The jungle terrain was brutal, steep slopes, thick vegetation, and weather that could turn clear skies into heavy downpour in minutes. Helicopter landings would be risky, supply lines fragile, and every movement slowed by mud and undergrowth. Most of all, intelligence suggested that the NVA's 29th Regiment, a seasoned and determined unit, was dug in and waiting. For Lieutenant General Melvin Zayas and Major General Melvin Howes, who commanded the 101st, the gamble was clear. The valley had to be challenged, even if it meant drawing the enemy into a bloody fight. No one could have predicted just how bloody that fight would become. On May 10, 1969, Operation Apache Snow began. Helicopters thundered above the thick jungle as American and South Vietnamese troops moved into the A Shau Valley. From the start, the soldiers knew this would be no ordinary mission. The valley's terrain worked against them at every turn. Steep ridges, endless mud, and trees so dense that daylight barely touched the ground. The initial landings met only light resistance. Small groups of North Vietnamese soldiers fired from hidden positions, then slipped back into the jungle. But these early skirmishes were only the beginning. The deeper the Americans pushed, the clearer it became that a larger enemy force was waiting. Booby traps and snipers slowed every advance, and patrols kept stumbling onto signs of well-prepared defensive lines. The 101st Airborne and their South Vietnamese allies pressed forward in coordinated sweeps. Artillery units pounded suspected strongholds while spotter planes and helicopters scouted the ridges. Supply drops came in under fire, with pilots forced to hover dangerously low over small clearings. Despite these challenges, the operation gained ground. Caches of rice, weapons, and ammunition were uncovered, proving that the valley was indeed a critical lifeline for the North Vietnamese army. But as the troops advanced, their attention shifted to one particular height, Hill 937. Reports confirmed that the enemy had turned the hill into a fortress, complete with bunkers, trenches, and overlapping fields of fire. The stage was set for a showdown that would soon become one of the most infamous battles of the entire Vietnam War. By mid-May 1969, American commanders had identified one position as the key to Operation Apache Snow. It was a steep, jungle-covered rise marked on maps simply as Hill 937, a number referring to its height in meters. For the soldiers who would fight there, the hill would soon earn another name, Hamburger Hill, because of the way men were chewed up in the fighting. The hill dominated the surrounding area of the A Shau Valley. Whoever held it could observe and control troop movement below. The North Vietnamese Army's 29th Regiment had dug in on its slopes, turning the hill into a fortress. They had built bunkers of logs and earth, hidden machine gun nests, and trench systems that zigzagged across the ridge. Their positions were reinforced by years of preparation. For the American 101st Airborne Division, Hill 937 could not simply be bypassed. Leaving it in enemy hands meant exposing the entire operation to ambush. The decision was made. The hill had to be taken, no matter the cost. May 10, 1969. The first assaults began with the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment, known as the Rakkasans. Helicopters lifted the paratroopers into landing zones near the base of the hill. Almost immediately, they met heavy fire. As the men pushed up the slopes, they were pinned down by machine guns and mortars hidden in the dense jungle. Casualties mounted quickly. By nightfall, the Americans had gained little ground. May 11th to 12th, reinforcements from other battalions joined the attack. Soldiers hacked their way through vines and elephant grass, often climbing on all fours up muddy slopes under fire. The enemy's defenses were nearly invisible until the moment they opened fire. Rain poured down, turning the ground into slippery clay. Medevac helicopters struggled to reach the wounded, and many had to be carried down the hill on stretchers by exhausted comrades. May 13th to 15th, artillery and airstrikes pounded Hill 937. Bombs and napalm ripped apart sections of jungle, yet the North Vietnamese kept fighting. Their bunkers were so well built that many survived direct hits. Each time American troops stormed a position, the defenders counterattacked from another angle. Progress was measured not in miles but in yards, sometimes just a few feet a day. Units rotated in and out, but no one escaped the sense that the hill itself was swallowing men whole. May 16th to 18th, the fighting reached its peak. Entire companies were pinned down, unable to advance. Communication lines broke down in the thick vegetation. Soldiers described hearing the screams of the wounded, mixed with the thunder of artillery echoing through the valley. Despite the punishing bombardment, the North Vietnamese fought with relentless determination. For the men of the 101st, fatigue set in. Boots rotted from the wet ground, weapons jammed from mud, and nerves stretched to the breaking point. May 19th to 20th. Finally, with fresh reinforcements and a coordinated push, the Americans launched a final assault. Multiple battalions attacked from different directions, supported by a massive curtain of artillery fire. Step by step, bunker by bunker, they cleared the summit. On May 20th, after 10 days of unbroken combat, Hill 937 was finally taken. The surviving North Vietnamese slipped away into the jungle, leaving behind shattered defenses and the bodies of their comrades. The battle for Hill 937 was remembered less for strategy and more for the sheer misery endured by the men who fought it. Visibility in the jungle was often no more than a few feet. Every step uphill was a struggle against mud, rain, and enemy fire. The slope itself became a weapon, forcing exhausted soldiers to climb while burdened with gear and under fire from above. Casualty evacuation was one of the greatest challenges. Wounded men had to be dragged down treacherous slopes while enemy snipers targeted medics. Supplies often ran low, and soldiers sometimes fought without enough food or dry clothing. The numbers told the story of the cost. The U.S. suffered 72 killed and 372 wounded in the battle for Hill 937. The North Vietnamese losses were estimated at more than 600 dead, though exact figures remain uncertain. For every inch of ground, blood had been paid on both sides. When the men of the 101st finally stood on the summit of Hill 937, there was no celebration. The hill offered little value beyond its symbolic weight. Within days, American commanders ordered it abandoned, leaving the scarred slopes to be reclaimed by the jungle. News of the battle reached the United States quickly. Reporters described it as a senseless meat grinder, a fight for a hill that was won at terrible cost and then given up. The phrase Hamburger Hill entered the American vocabulary, not as a victory, but as a symbol of the futility of the war. In Congress, the battle sparked heated debate. Lawmakers demanded to know why American soldiers were still being thrown into such costly fights. For many, Hill 937 was the final straw that proved the war was unwinnable through attrition. For the soldiers who fought there, the memories were seared forever. They had followed orders, endured unimaginable hardship, and taken the hill through courage and sacrifice. Yet they returned home to headlines questioning whether their effort had meant anything at all. The battle for Hill 937 became one of the most infamous clashes of the Vietnam War, remembered not just for its brutality, but for the way it shaped America's view of the conflict itself. Operation Apache Snow was never only about one hill. While the fight for Hill 937 became the defining image, the larger operation stretched across the length of the A Shau Valley. Multiple battalions of the 101st Airborne Division, together with South Vietnamese units, swept through other ridges and valleys during May and June of 1969. In these actions, American and ARVN forces uncovered vast caches of enemy supplies, tons of rice, medical kits, weapons, and ammunition. Bunkers were destroyed, base camps burned, and communication routes disrupted. Helicopter assaults inserted units onto ridgelines while artillery kept pressure on suspected enemy hideouts. In tactical terms, the operation inflicted heavy losses on the North Vietnamese army and temporarily pushed them out of their sanctuaries. But the results were not permanent. The North Vietnamese had long mastered the art of withdrawal and return. Even as U.S. forces cleared hill after hill, the enemy slipped across the Laotian border to regroup. Within months, they would be back in the valley, rebuilding what had been lost. The jungle itself seemed to erase the scars of battle, swallowing bunkers and trails almost as quickly as they were destroyed. Casualties reflected the intensity of the operation. U.S. forces reported several hundred killed and wounded across the valley. ARVN losses added to the toll. North Vietnamese casualties were claimed to be more than 1,000 dead, though such figures were often disputed. Regardless of numbers, both sides had paid dearly. In military briefings, commanders presented Apache Snow as a success. The operation had disrupted enemy logistics and proved that American and South Vietnamese forces could strike deep into the enemy's heartland. Yet beneath the official reports lay a harsher truth. The valley remained contested, and the strategic balance had barely shifted. What lingered most was not the captured supplies or the destroyed bunkers, but the haunting memory of Hamburger Hill, a single battle that overshadowed the entire campaign. The capture of Hill 937 was, on paper, a tactical victory. American and South Vietnamese forces had pushed the enemy off a fortified position, destroyed supply caches, and inflicted heavy casualties. But the way the battle unfolded and how it was perceived sparked one of the most intense political firestorms of the Vietnam War. When news of Hamburger Hill reached the United States, the public reaction was swift and angry. Headlines described young Americans being thrown against a hill of little value, suffering heavy losses, only for the position to be abandoned days later. To many civilians, it looked like senseless sacrifice. The name Hamburger Hill itself, coined by soldiers in the field, reinforced the image of men being ground up in a futile struggle. In Washington, the controversy reached Congress. Senator Edward Kennedy called the assault senseless and irresponsible. Other lawmakers demanded answers. Why had commanders committed so many troops to storm a jungle-covered hill? Why was the U.S. military still conducting costly frontal assaults years into a war that seemed no closer to ending? The criticism placed pressure on the Nixon administration. President Richard Nixon had already begun speaking of Vietnamization, the idea of gradually shifting the burden of fighting to South Vietnamese forces while withdrawing American combat units. Hamburger Hill gave this policy new urgency. The backlash convinced commanders to scale back large-scale search and destroy missions, focusing instead on advisory roles and support. For the U.S. Army, the battle raised difficult lessons. It showed the limits of attritional warfare in Vietnam. Even a well-executed operation, backed by overwhelming firepower, could produce results that were temporary and politically damaging. Holding ground mattered little if the cost of taking it alienated the American public and lawmakers back home. For the North Vietnamese, the battle was a grim but useful propaganda tool. Though they lost hundreds of men, they had proven that a determined force could tie down elite American units and spark division within U.S. society. In their strategy of protracted war, that was victory enough. In the end, the political impact of Apache Snow far outweighed its military gains. It shifted U.S. strategy toward withdrawal and left a lasting mark on how Americans remembered the conflict. The legacy of Operation Apache Snow, and especially the battle for Hill 937, extends far beyond the jungles of the A Shau Valley. For veterans who fought there, it remains one of the most searing experiences of their lives, a test of endurance, courage, and survival under some of the harshest conditions of the war. Many carried the psychological scars long after leaving Vietnam. In American culture, the name Hamburger Hill became synonymous with the futility of the Vietnam War. Books, memoirs, and news reports kept the story alive, often focusing on the heavy cost and questionable value of the fight. In 1987, the film Hamburger Hill brought the battle to a new generation, portraying the raw brutality of the fighting and the bonds of soldiers caught in its grip. For military historians, the operation is a case study in the dangers of attritional warfare. Apache Snow demonstrated how U.S. forces could achieve tactical success, yet still lose ground strategically and politically. The decision to abandon Hill 937 shortly after capturing it is often cited as a symbol of the contradictions that define the American effort in Vietnam. For the North Vietnamese, the legacy was different. Though they lost hundreds of soldiers, they showed once again that they could absorb staggering losses, withdraw, and return. In their view, battles like Hamburger Hill proved the resilience of their cause and the limits of American willpower. Today, Hill 937 is reclaimed by the jungle. Visitors see little more than quiet ridges covered in green. But for those who know the history, the ground remains haunted by the memory of a battle that came to define the Vietnam War itself. Operation Apache Snow was planned as a sweep to disrupt enemy strongholds in the A Shau Valley, but its legacy was shaped by a single hill. The battle for Hill 937, remembered as Hamburger Hill, revealed the paradox at the heart of the Vietnam War. American forces could fight with skill, courage, and overwhelming firepower, yet the victories they won often came at costs too high to justify and with results too temporary to matter. For the soldiers of the 101st Airborne and their South Vietnamese allies, the operation was a crucible. They endured days of mud, rain, exhaustion, and relentless combat, fighting yard by yard against a determined enemy. They took the hill, proving their resolve, but were ordered to abandon it soon after. Their sacrifice became the spark of a national debate over the direction and purpose of the war. Politically, Apache Snow accelerated a shift already underway. It reinforced President Nixon's push for Vietnamization and deepened skepticism in Congress and among the American public. Strategically, it underlined that controlling ground in Vietnam often meant little in the long run. Today, when historians and veterans speak of Hamburger Hill, they remember not just the blood and hardship of the battle itself, but what it represented, a turning point where the limits of America's war effort became painfully clear. Operation Apache Snow was, in many ways, a victory that felt like defeat. If you found this story powerful, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Most of you watching aren't subscribed yet, and by joining us, you'll never miss the next untold story from the Vietnam War. And thank you for watching.